My name is Ty, and I work for UNICEF USA, the United Nations Children's Fund. I'm here to talk a little bit about the work that we do and how it intersects with a lot of the work that Fair Trade does. So I guess I'll preface my presentation by saying at UNICEF we believe that it is both a wonderful time for children and one of the worst times for children. We're close to ending diseases that have plagued children and their families for generations. We have more children enrolled in school than in any time in recorded history. At the same time, we have outbreaks of conflict that continue to rage on and on without an end in sight. And we have children continued to be made vulnerable in industries, whether that be agriculture, mining, etc. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, if I work this correctly, fantastic, is ask you all a few questions. All right, so if you raise your hand, that means true. You think that what is on screen is true. So the majority of trafficked children are exploited for sex. Raise your hand if you believe this to be true. Raise your hand if you believe this to be true. All right, all right. So that is actually false, right? So within the United States, the majority of children are trafficked for sex, right? But globally, right, there are far more children involved in other types of forced labor than sex itself, all right? Sex work, I should say. All right, so most trafficked in the United States are not US citizens. Raise your hand if you think this is true. Don't be shy, don't be shy. All right, we can put our hands down. So that also happens to be false. All right? So there's a misconception that a lot of the labor, forced labor that occurs in the United States involves people coming from other countries. However, the vast majority of children who are forced into labor in the United States are actually identified as United States citizens. All right? This isn't in any means to minimize, right, the considerable amount of children who are trafficked and forced into labor once they arrive here or who arrive and don't have documentation. However, the vast majority of children employed in forced labor in the United States are actually United States citizens, right? And finally, about 2/3 of people who are engaged in forced labor, children engaged in forced labor, are women and girls globally. Raise your hand if you think that is true. All right, unfortunately, that is true, all right? So I work for the United Nations Children's Fund, all right, and I'm going to start off just by defining human trafficking, okay? So we define it as the act of harboring, recruiting, transporting, transferring, receiving a person by the means of force, fraud, coercion for the purpose of exploitation. Now, for a child under 18, which of these do you think is not relevant? Can anyone guess? Can anyone guess? Any brave person? We have act, we have the means, and we have purpose. Which do you think? Can anyone take a guess? One brave soul. All the way over there. Excellent. The means, right? So children are children. And since they're under 18, by US law and by the laws of many countries around the world and many international organizations, they can't consent. So it doesn't matter if they say yes. It doesn't matter if they're forced, tricked, etc., they still can't consent, all right? So, the numbers. So, according to the International Labor Organization, about 10 million children are subjected to modern slavery worldwide. And this statistic is as of 2016, and that is double the ILO's estimate in 2012, right? So we have a lot of work to do when we think of Sustainable Development Goal 8, right, and all the other sub-goals that fall under that in terms of ensuring that no child is subjected to slavery, right? So in terms of the amount of money, sheer money, that is raised by trafficking children and forcing them into labor in many different industries, we often think of child labor as things like agriculture, mining, things that you have to do with your hands, but it turns out a considerable amount of child labor is also in hotels just like this, even here in the United States, right? So $39 billion, right? People get on stage and they say numbers, right? And $39 billion, I'm assuming most of us can't comprehend what that amount of money is, right? But that is the combined revenue of Google and Microsoft, right? If we took every professional sports franchise in the United States and added up their revenue, right, that would equal close to $39 billion. So this is a lot of money moving around the world. All right, so what fuels trafficking? We like to break it down into 3 areas. First, we have supply and demand, like any other business. Trafficking is one of the few areas where the supply and demand are essentially the same thing. You have human beings, right? Human beings demanding, right, other human beings, all right? Second, high reward and low risk, right? So it is very common for people who are engaged in trafficking children to get a tap on the wrist when caught. Sometimes, in some countries, the fine for the children, right, or the persons that are trafficked are actually harsher than the fines given to the people doing the trafficking, right? And so UNICEF works to try to encourage governments to adjust frameworks and implement systems to protect children and punish traffickers, right? Next, finally, we have systemic inequalities. So the thing about trafficking and the thing about anything, because these are all intersectional things that are related, that is connected to trafficking, is that poverty is at its base, right? And we know that poverty can be cyclical, right? And unfortunately, if poverty is cyclical, then many of the other industries that pop up and take advantage of people living in poverty are also cyclical. All right? And so that is why things like ensuring that girls are in school, right? Access to clean water, et cetera, all of these are also related to ending child labor. All right, so this could look like many different things, right? Child marriage is something that is not often included in the definition of trafficking. Begging, forced begging, which you can see in many countries that are suffering from poverty. Sweatshops, pornography, farming, domestic labor, sex tourism, and finally, armed groups. All right, so if we're assuming that there's a child, right, the average child, according to our data, right, would have 5 buyers per day, 7 days per week, at 52 weeks per year, okay? And this equals 1,820 sessions, right, with clients in a single year, right? And to put that into perspective, the trafficker, if we're taking the average of $200, is making around $364,000 per year. $364,000 per year, right? And sometimes, especially outside of sex, children who are forced to work in the sex industry, right, this could also be $200 in the form of this child doing $200 worth of free labor every single day, right, for something like the shirt that we might pick up at a store like H&M or something like that, right, fast fashion stores, all right? So what is our approach? What is UNICEF's approach? So first, we believe in addressing harmful social norms, right? So that kind of combats child marriage, right, where there might be an incentive, right, to parents to force their children to marry someone for money, right? This might be strengthening systems, right, which involves implementing legal frameworks, involves working with governments to ensure that there is access to education. There are things for children to do, and actually punishing traffickers for trafficking children, okay? So I'll just go through a few case studies. These are children in Cote d'Ivoire. UNICEF worked with Cote d'Ivoire to implement a nationwide child protection framework, all right? And these are children who are forced to work on a cacao farm, right, to make chocolate. All right, child marriage. We have a number of programs going on in India, right, to protect children there and to prevent children from being used in labor there as well. And then finally, sex trafficking. We focus on ensuring that children are protected and that there are severe and harsh punishments for the people that are trafficking them. And then finally, children on the move, right? We have more children moving across borders than at any time since World War II, and a lot of these children disappear, right? And we want to make sure that these children are accounted for from the countries they are coming from to the countries they are going to, and that children aren't lost and taken out of this, All right, so quickly, what can you do to take action? All right, visit act.unicef.usa.org. And finally, conscious consumerism. You all are here, you all know about fair trade, right? You all make responsible purchasing decisions. And then just continue learning. So thank you all so much, and I really appreciate your time.